External respiration takes place in the lungs. It is the process in which exchange of gases takes place between the alveolus and the pulmonary capillary. Air that's inhaled arrives at the alveolus, crosses the alveolar wall, crosses the capillary wall, and ends up in the pulmonary capillary. This way, oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the capillary. Carbon dioxide diffuses from the capillary to the alveolus. There are 5 factors that affect simple diffusion, and they also affect external respiration. Membrane thickness, when it increases, decreases the speed of diffusion. Membrane surface area, when that increases, it also increases the speed of diffusion. The third factor is pressure gradient. When the pressure gradient is high, the speed of diffusion increases. The partial pressure of a gas increases the speed of diffusion. The greater the partial pressure of a gas, the greater the speed of diffusion. The solubility of the gas in water is also important. So the greater the solubility of the gas in water, the faster the speed of diffusion. These last 2 factors, partial pressure and solubility, come under Henry's law, which we will talk about a little bit later. Membrane thickness is the one factor that when it increases, it actually decreases the speed of diffusion. This makes sense because when you have a thick membrane, this would present a greater barrier for substances to diffuse. So the greater the membrane thickness, the slower the speed of diffusion. This becomes important in pneumonia. When a person has pneumonia, the amount of fluid that accumulates in the alveolus is so high that it actually makes the alveolar wall much thicker than normal. As a result, the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide is extremely slow. So that's the alveolar wall, and here is the mucus that accumulates on the inside of the alveolar wall. This lowers the speed of diffusion, and the speed of diffusion is so slow that it can no longer support life. So that's why people with pneumonia die. In the lungs, the membrane surface area really comes from the alveolar walls. If the alveolar walls are intact, then the membrane surface area is high and the speed of diffusion is also high. So the greater the membrane surface area, the faster the speed of diffusion. This is for the normal lungs. In patients with emphysema, this becomes a problem because the alveolar walls are destroyed by cigarette smoke. So the membrane surface area is decreased greatly in emphysema patients, and so the speed of diffusion also goes down drastically. As a result, oxygen cannot diffuse fast enough into the tissues, and there is chronic hypoxemia. So let's take a look at the alveolus that's normal. And this is the alveolar sac being damaged, the walls are damaged. In emphysema, there are no walls in between, and this greatly reduces the speed of diffusion. When the pressure gradient increases, the speed of diffusion also increases. So greater the pressure gradient, the faster the speed of diffusion. So let's take a look at this graph here. The one with the highest gradient is the steepest gradient that you see here. And that is air coming from in a hyperbaric chamber at 3 atmospheres. It's 3 times the atmospheric pressure. So this obviously increases the speed of diffusion. The opposite is the reduced gradient. So imagine that you are at a very high altitude in Quito, Ecuador, or in Colorado on a very high ski slope. The air is at 3,000 meters, is a very low pressure. So this causes the oxygen to diffuse much more slowly, which is why people get mountain sickness when they are at a very high altitude. We live in New York City, and here is the sea level. It's 1 atmosphere, and this has a normal diffusion of oxygen. So the greater the gradient, the faster the diffusion. The lower the gradient, the slower the diffusion. So let's write that down. According to Henry's law, the diffusion of a gas depends upon its partial pressure and the solubility of gas in water. So, the greater the partial pressure of a gas, the faster the speed of diffusion. Now, when we think about inspired air, nitrogen has the greatest partial pressure. The amount of nitrogen in atmospheric air is 78%. Oxygen is only 21%. By this account, nitrogen should be the one that crosses the alveolar wall, crosses the capillary wall, and ends up in our bloodstream and in all of our tissues. However, that is not the case because nitrogen is not soluble in water under normal conditions. It is oxygen that satisfies both rules. Oxygen has a fairly decent partial pressure, about 21%, and it is also soluble in water, and so it is oxygen that ends up in our tissues. So let's make this clear. Under Henry's law, we now know that in normal conditions, it is oxygen that ends up in our tissues. So oxygen diffuses across the capillary and alveolar walls, and they end up in all of our tissues. Nitrogen, on the other hand, does not diffuse across the alveolar and capillary walls because they're not soluble. It is not soluble in water, and so it ends up being exhaled along with carbon dioxide. All this changes in deep sea diving. At the ocean depth, the pressure is very high. It's 4 times the atmospheric pressure. And so the partial pressure of nitrogen is extremely high, high enough that it overrides the solubility factor, and nitrogen is forced into the pulmonary capillaries. So here we have a deep sea diver who is enjoying some kind of fantasy with a mermaid. So what's going on here? The nitrogen in the brain produces a narcotic effect. The narcotic effect is often referred to as raptures of the deep. When the scuba diver is closer to the surface of the water, the nitrogen does not enter the tissues. However, as he moves down deeper into the ocean, the atmospheric pressure is twice the level of atmospheric pressure at sea level. So nitrogen is forced into his blood and also reaches all of his tissues. If he swims up slowly back to the surface, then there is enough time for the nitrogen to leave his tissues as he's breathing out. However, if he swims up too quickly, then what will happen is that the nitrogen is still stuck in his tissues. It's stuck in his brain, it's stuck in his joints. So as he comes up, it produces a very painful condition known as the bends. Another term for the bends is decompression sickness. It is characterized by skin rash, vertigo, poor balance, confusion, nausea, fatigue, abdominal pain, and joint pain. The person with decompression sickness cannot board a plane right after because the pressure decreases as you go up on the plane, and nitrogen will then continue to leave the tissues and cause the person considerable amount of discomfort and great pain. let's look at the role of hemoglobin and what it binds during transport of gases. So in the alveolus, here's the alveolus, the oxygen leaves the alveolus, and in the capillary, here's your oxygen, the hemoglobin is waiting and to pick up the oxygen, and you get oxyhemoglobin, which is red. Now this oxyhemoglobin travels to, in the bloodstream, it travels to the body cells. In the body cell, the hemoglobin releases the oxygen, so it becomes blue again, and the oxygen is released into the body cell. So there's your oxygen going into the body cell to help with cellular respiration. In the body cell, the carbon dioxide that's released from the cellular respiration comes out of the body cell, and it combines with hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin becomes carbaminohemoglobin. So hemoglobin has the ability to bind both oxygen and carbon dioxide. It only binds with carbon dioxide after it has dropped off the oxygen. There is a third molecule that binds to hemoglobin, and that molecule is a dangerous one. It is carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is not normally found in blood, but when it is found in blood, it has a very, very, very strong affinity to hemoglobin, to the point that hemoglobin cannot bind to oxygen, which is supposed to normally. This is oxygen. Hemoglobin normally binds to oxygen. Hemoglobin normally binds to carbon dioxide, but it has the highest affinity for carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide binds 200 times more tightly to hemoglobin than oxygen. As a result, you can die of carbon monoxide poisoning, which is why we have those carbon monoxide sensors in our apartments, because if carbon monoxide finds hemoglobin, there is no hope. Oxygen can no longer bind to hemoglobin and death can result. We know that oxygen binds to hemoglobin. However, what prompts the hemoglobin to release the oxygen? So this would depend upon whether or not a tissue is active. An active tissue clearly demands more oxygen, so the hemoglobin will release the oxygen there. Now, in order to understand how that happens and in what situations it happens, we need to look at these percent oxygen saturation of hemoglobin graphs. And to do that, we need to understand some basic facts. So let's go over those first. Number 1, a hemoglobin molecule can hold up to 4 oxygen atoms. If all 4 positions are occupied by oxygen, then the hemoglobin is said to be saturated. Let's look at this graph. Here, the line corresponds to where the saturation curves, the line corresponds to about 75%. So we can safely say that the hemoglobin is 75% saturated. This means 3 out of 4 of the positions in hemoglobin are occupied with oxygen. So the hemoglobin is holding on to 3 of the oxygens. So let's look at the next 2 rules that we need to know. And that has to do with the position of these curves. Now look at the normal here. This is the normal body temperature, and this is the blue line that you see here is the normal. That is your 75% saturation that we just talked about. If there is a curve that is to the right of the normal, so this is right of the normal, then this means that oxygen is being released. Means the hemoglobin is giving up the oxygen. If there are any lines that are to the left of the normal, this means that oxygen is being held by the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is holding on to the oxygen. This is how hemoglobin decides whether or not to give up the oxygen. So when you look at this at 43 degrees Celsius, the temperature of a tissue which is very high clearly means that the tissue is metabolically active. So the hemoglobin decides to give up the oxygen. So any curve to the right means giving up the oxygen. Any curve to the left means holding on to the oxygen. So clearly a tissue that's cold, 10 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, is much lower than body temperature. The hemoglobin decides to hold on to the oxygen and says, well, you're not doing anything. You don't need any oxygen. So the hemoglobin holds on to the oxygen. Let's interpret the oxygen dissociation curves for pH. Let's look at the normal pH first. Here we have the normal pH, and like we said earlier, anything to the right means that the oxygen is being released. So just by going with our rules, we'll say oxygen is being released or dissociated. Oxygen is dissociated. And anything to the left means oxygen is being held. Now let's see if that makes sense from a physiological point of view. Why is it that pH 7.2 is on the right side? It's on the right side because any tissue that's active tends to have a lower pH than normal. So an active tissue will have a low pH. So pH is very low when a tissue is active. When a tissue is passive, not working very hard, is sort of an inactive tissue. When you have an inactive tissue, then the pH tends to be high.